few weeks ago, I received a letter from a listener named Michael Strauss. He wrote to Intractable after finishing episode 1, and he said he had a bit of a bone to pick. There was one part of the way that we described the history of Zionism that didn't sit quite right with him. Michael describes himself as a modern religious Jew, and I was excited to have his perspective to counterbalance my own, since, as you all are probably well aware of by now, I am not exactly a religious person. I asked if maybe he wouldn't mind recording his thoughts for us so that I could share them in an episode. Michael was kind enough to oblige, so this week we're going to start with a few of his thoughts.
First things first, great podcast so far, one episode in. Sounds like you've done your homework and are trying your hardest to stay well balanced. I'm a modern religious Jew, so that's where my point of view is coming from on the most basic level. But something always kind of bugs me whenever I hear anyone who's not particularly religious addressing the topic you chose to cover. To quote you, "Thus, the birth of modern political Zionism, a movement to establish a national home for the Jewish people in the same land that had once millennia before been home to biblical Jewish kings." I'd like to add that it's a land to which the Jews had never ceased longing to return for all those millennia. Secular political Zionism did not create the idea of a return to the land of Israel out of thin air after a bunch of anti-Semitism, nor did it create the idea of an ancient historical longing that just was dormant for a really, really long time. What I think looking at this conflict through the lens of a secular political movement especially leaves out is something that is familiar to anyone who well acquainted with the first verse of the Torah and its explanation by the most prominent of all Torah commentaries, Rashi. So like any rabbinic literature, there are many ways to interpret Rashi's idea, but the simplest reading of the number one commentary on the very first verse of the entire corpus of Jewish law seems to be saying that the reason God even created the earth in the first place is pretty much so that the Jews can say to the other inhabitants of Israel that he's the one who decides where and who gets what land, and not some army or political party or national movement. And as a deeply religious person, I've found that secular people can have a hard time understanding such severe and unwavering dedication to anything, whether it be the idea of not touching your phone for the 25 hours or so of a Shabbos, or not eating any bread or a bunch of other products for 7 or 8 days of Passover, which just passed. This is what religious people believe. I mean, we believe it in our heart. And, I believe, just like I believe in Shabbos, just like I believe in Pesach and all the other laws, and putting tefillin on every day and trying to pray 3 times a day, just like, Muslims try to pray 5 times a day and try to wear their hijab and keep halal and do everything else that they try to do. We believe in what we believe. And, that's about it.
Michael's email seemed particularly topical, not because he's an Israeli himself. He actually was born and raised in Monsey, New York, and now lives in Queens, but because his viewpoint is one that many religious people here do share. It represents one that, like he said, isn't often mentioned in the way we talk about the conflict. And most importantly, it greatly affects the one hot-button issue that we're going to be discussing today: the settlements.
Suddenly I have this light bulb that goes off in my mind, and I say to myself, this is a moment of blessing. Because for the first time in my life, I'm experiencing how the other experiences me.
There are facts on the ground, whether we like them or not, that have been created and have to be dealt with.
You are creating society purpose. You are not, protecting Israel. Because they come here, maybe they throw stones toward a military jeep, maybe. But by what you do, you destroy their dignity. And when you destroy the dignity of a person, he has nothing to lose.
What I'm trying to say is this is not an active everyday choice. Oh, I want to be a settler. This is how these women grew up.
There's also a little problem, ironically you could say, but In fact, not little at all. And that is the question, what do you do with the million of Palestinians residing in this area?
There's a good chance you're familiar with the term settler, and an even greater chance that in your consumption of Israeli-Palestinian news coverage, you've encountered the term West Bank settlement. Even if you haven't seen images of them or visited them or lived there, you probably have picked up on the tropes. Construction sites nestled between rolling hills, desert landscapes and stone buildings, bearded Jewish settlers wearing kippot, some of them carrying guns, perhaps Israeli soldiers on patrol. The settlements are one of those issues that the international media loves to cover, partially because it is such a controversial topic, often referred to by the UN and by international diplomats as one of, if not the main, roadblocks to peace. But, and this should come as no surprise to you if you've been listening to our previous episodes so far, it's really not so simple. Before we jump into a deeper look at the history of Jewish communities in the West Bank, the ideologies that motivate settlers to move past the Green Line, and the complex political implications of this population, let's start with a much simpler question. How many settlers are there in the West Bank today? As of July 2017, the estimated overall population of the West Bank was around 2.7 million. Of this number, there are somewhere around 400,000 Israeli settlers living in the region, not counting those who live in what's considered to be East Jerusalem. It's always a bit of a challenge to talk about geography, but let's just pause quickly to go over a few things about what we might call the anatomy of the West Bank. This would be a good time for me to correct a small mistake that I made back in episode 1, actually. A mistake that a handful of listeners who are very well read on their history pointed out to me. The line that separates the West Bank from Israel proper is known as the Green Line. I mistakenly said that this line was drawn in the UN partition plan, when in fact it was set in the 1949 armistice agreements that ended the 1948 war. This line demarcated where Israel stopped and where the Jordan-controlled area began. And in 1967, when Israel surprised pretty much the entire world, including themselves, by nearly tripling their landmass, the West Bank and Jerusalem came under Israeli control. The settler movement, as we think of it today, more or less began then, in 1967, as a result of this fact. And we'll get back to that in just a moment. But another thing you need to understand about the West Bank is the very particular breakdown of authority that affects its different communities. You might remember that in our last episode, we touched briefly on the fact that the West Bank is split into sub-areas A, B, and C. This distinction was created in the Oslo Accords of the 1990s and established basically a breakdown of authority. Area A, made up of Palestinian cities and urban areas, would be under full Palestinian civil and security control. This is the area that is forbidden for Israelis to enter. Area B, primarily made up of Palestinian villages and more suburban and rural areas, would be under Palestinian civil control, but Israeli security. Area C, however, would remain under full Israeli control, with the idea that, over time, the land would gradually be released to Palestinian authorities as peace negotiations continued. The main problem, of course, is that peace negotiations did not continue. This last block of land is largely where the settlements are constructed. It also makes up 61% of the landmass of the West Bank and contains the majority of the agricultural and water resources of the region. And if we talk population just within Area C, Israelis are actually in the majority, with 400,000 settlers to 300,000 Palestinians. Of course, this wasn't always the case. Settlement expansion is something that has happened at seemingly a faster and faster pace each decade since the 1967 war that brought the West Bank under Israeli control. For example, if you look at a map of the West Bank today, marked to show Jewish and Palestinian populations, it looks less like two contiguous areas and more like a scatterplot of data points on a graph. What's more is that most of these places aren't the huts or temporary buildings you'd think of when you hear the word settlement. Many of these settlements are, to varying degrees, cities and towns. Some of them have been around for decades. This is the thing that makes supporters of a two-state solution feel uneasy. At the end of the day, how do you create, as their saying goes, two states for two peoples if you can't draw a map of what that would look like? To what extent, in other words, has the gradual geographic interweaving of Jewish and Palestinian communities in the West Bank gotten so tangled that the knots can't be undone? Before we answer this question, there are a few things we need to understand about the settlements themselves. For this, I turned to two experts, one Israeli and one American. This is Dr. Ronit Levine-Schnur, an expert on the laws that govern the West Bank when it comes to deciding what lands belong to whom.
I work mostly on property, land use, urban development issues.
In other words, she's a professional knot detangler in one of the most complex legal situations relating to the conflict. Because the map of the West Bank is so confusing these days and the area itself is so contested, I called Dr. Levine-Schnur one afternoon recently to get her help in decoding it all.
So with regards to this area, Israel stood in the face of a huge conflict. On the one hand, Israel approached the area as territory that it's under its governance as an occupied territory under belligerent occupation doctrines from the international law. So in that regard, Israel, or the Israeli army, approached the area as something that was laid to its management, administration, until future peace settlements will be secured. On the other hand, soon after 1967, some Israeli groups started to evolve with the notion that these are in fact parts of the ancient territory of Israel. And these are parts, the West Bank I refer to, these are parts of our homeland, the historic Holy Land. So in that sense, we didn't occupy them in the formal legal terms that senior administration view it, but rather we actually gained control of what was always ours.
Dr. Levine-Schnur says that this sort of duality almost in philosophies shaped the paradox of today's situation. On the one hand, the upper levels of Israeli military and government saw the West Bank in literal legal terms as an occupied territory, one that Israel controlled from the outside, in which there lived a sizable civilian population who were not citizens of the controlling power. And this view meant that it violated international law to move new civilian populations, like settlers, into the area. On the other hand, several groups, but most importantly the religious Zionist movement, saw the region as the birthright of the Jewish people, the biblical regions of Judea and Samaria. And their view of these captured territories, or as they would say, recaptured territories, as a natural part of Israel, eventually led the Israeli government to support, subsidize, and formalize a handful of settlements past the Green Line. Some of this support was ideological, and some support was practical, in that the West Bank could serve as an important foothold and buffer zone between Israel and its Arab neighbors.
That, at times, becomes a totally unstable state of affairs, what I refer to as a paradox. Israel cannot hold both narratives, because there's a certain point in which you cannot justify certain civilian activities.
As for how this all took place ideologically and politically, I turned to Dr. Sara Yael Hirschhorn, a lecturer and fellow at Oxford University's Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, and an academic, specifically, of the history of the settler movement.
not that much scholarship out there about settlers. You would think this is like a really sexy topic and everybody would want to be writing about it all the time. But because there's sort of a limitation of sources for a variety of reasons, and also, it's a hot potato politically, there's a lot less academic work being done on settlers than you might think.
Dr. Hirschhorn is the author of City on a Hilltop, American Jews and the Israeli Settler Movement, which was recently announced as a finalist for the 2018 Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. In short, she's one of the foremost experts on the history of settlements and the settler movement, the different ideological strands within the movement, and what I found to be one of the more shocking aspects of the topic, the scope of American involvement.
Americans are definitely overrepresented, both within the Israeli settler movement themselves, where they comprise something like 15% of the settler camp today, as well as when Americans in Israel, where there's something like a third to a half of Americans that are living, in Israel, Palestine, I guess, shall we say, which is, quite a large group of people and, definitely surprised me.
I'll just repeat that in case you missed it. Of the Israeli population living in the West Bank, 15% were born and raised in America. And not just that, but of the total population of American citizens living in Israel, 1/3 to 1/2 of them choose to live east of the Green Line. 15% isn't anywhere close to a majority, but it still becomes something of a cultural trope here. I've asked Israelis who live in Tel Aviv what they think of the settlements, and even if they've never been to one, they've picked up on this American wave of migration, talking about the settlements as though they're a somewhat foreign-led movement. My question as an American investigating the conflict was, what is it that pushes someone religiously, politically, philosophically, and so forth to move thousands of miles around the world and set up a home not just in Israel, but right on one of the tensest front lines of the conflict? It turns out that's exactly what Sara investigated in her research, and the results might surprise you.
I primarily focused on the first generation of Americans that came after the 1967 war, at the peak of Jewish American immigration to Israel, where tens of thousands of Americans decided to make Aliyah. And I found that they were really part and parcel of their generation. These were young, highly educated, something like 10% of them hold the doctorate, upwardly mobile Americans who weren't leaving the United States because they didn't have a future there or they weren't succeeding in their lives in America, but because they were ideologically driven for a variety of reasons to move not only to Israel, but to take that further step and sort of move beyond the Green Line. But what really surprised me the most was that, these people weren't necessarily like right-wing ideologues or messianic fanatics or religious fundamentalists in the way that we talk about them in the media all the time. In fact, these are people who were part and parcel of the 1960s generation in which they grew up. These are people who voted for the Democratic Party and had been active in the liberal social movements of their day and sort of translated both the ideology and tactics of their activism on the left in the United States to joining a project on the right in Israel. If anything, they were closer to being like tree-hugging hippies than neoconservatives, and the way that we often think about them is probably not accurate.
This group of what you might call hippie American settlers merged with an Israeli movement that Sara says began almost entirely without government approval.
The government is overtaken by events that began in the summer of 1967, when a group of basically kibbutzniks who had lived in the Gush Etzion region of the West Bank, which is an area right outside of Jerusalem, in the 1930s and 1940s, before the first Arab-Israeli war, they decided that they want to go home to where they grew up as children. And in the summer of 1967, they returned to these 4 kibbutzim in the area, and thus the Israeli settler movement begins.
The settlers who returned to Gush Etzion, as Sara said, had once lived there as children, prior to the 1948 war. The agricultural communes, or kibbutzim, that they lived in had been destroyed during the war by Arab forces in an event known best to Israelis as the Kfar Etzion massacre, which led to the deaths of 130 of the Jewish inhabitants. Almost simultaneously, another movement sprung up to resettle a Jewish population in the ancient city of Hebron, a city that had, until 1929, been home to a mixed Jewish-Muslim population. That year, however, an Arab mob, thought to be motivated by rumors of Jews massacring Arabs in Jerusalem, attacked members of Hebron's Jewish community, killing 67 and injuring 58 more. Survivors of the attack were evacuated from the city. So, decades later, in the spring of 1968, motivated in part by the messianic philosophies of a major rabbi of the time, a group of Israelis went to Hebron without governmental permission and attempted to gain the right to stay in a truly strange fashion. They posed as Swiss tourists, rented out the main hotel in Hebron, and then refused to leave. The government ordered their evacuation, but agreed, after some discussion, to relocate them to a nearby military base. And this location eventually became the settlement of Kiryat Arba. Now, unlike in Gush Etzion, the settlers who went to Hebron were not the direct descendants of the survivors of the 1929 massacre, but they were religiously motivated by the idea that by restoring a Jewish presence in Hebron, they would hasten the arrival of the Messiah. And to some settlers in Hebron, this holy mission meant that they would need sometimes to violate secular laws in order to accomplish their goal.
Between 1967 and 1973, that's it. Those 4 kibbutzim and the reestablishment of a presence in Hebron. After the 1973 war, which is very devastating for the state of Israel, both militarily and economically, that's when you begin to see settlements start to take off in the West Bank, primarily in the first decade, say 1967 to 1977, led by a group called Gush Amonim, the Bloc of the Faithful, which is national religious settlers who are primarily Orthodox. Over 100,000 Jewish Israelis moved into the occupied territories over the course of a decade. So it goes from, a handful of very ideological settlers in the 1970s to a real kind of, mass movement in the 1980s, which continues throughout the 1990s and into today.
So the settler movement as we know it today is deeply rooted in 3 things: religion, security, and economics. On the one hand, we have the fervor of those who believe that this particular stretch of land must belong to Israel because God said it did. On the other, we have the collective traumas of war and of massacres, like those in Hebron and Kfar Etzion, which encourage this movement that sees settlements as intrinsically tied to the Jewish people's fight for survival. You can still see this repeating today. Every time there's a terror attack on settler communities, you hear the usual proclamations by Israeli politicians that the only answer is more settlements. And then there's this third issue, economics. The simple fact that land and homes are cheaper east of the Green Line. And a good number of settlers, more perhaps than you might think, are motivated by that not-so-ideological fact. But what about the settlers who were born east of the Green Line? Those who have lived there their whole lives, and those who only know this as their world and their home. We're going to return to both Gush Etzion and Hebron in just a moment to speak with a religious settler and a Palestinian resident. But first, I want to introduce you to Ayelet Bechar, an Israeli documentary filmmaker who wanted to understand what life is like for this generation of Israelis who truly know this region as their home, and whose future hangs in the balance as politicians continue to negotiate what exactly is going to happen with the West Bank.
Armed started in the classroom. It was the first class of journalism, kind of journalism 101 in Sapir College, and I asked the students to introduce themselves. And one of the students said, well, my name is Liora, and this morning I woke up at 5 a.m. to herd my sheep in my farm, which is right on the Green Line. And she also mentioned that she is armed in a long-barreled M16. So I thought, ding, that's very interesting. I want to go there.
I wanted to talk to Ayelet about this project because one thing I think never really makes it into the media is how internally Israeli society discusses the settlements. And you can see that reckoning clearly in Ayelet's work. Her project, Hamushot, or in English, Armed, is a series of documentary shorts that follow a handful of Israeli women who live in the West Bank, each of whom is authorized to carry a weapon, and each of whom has to navigate her identity as a woman and as an armed settler in her daily life. Take, for example, Leora, one of Ayelet's journalism students, and the first protagonist we meet in Armed. Leora lives on a farm just over the Green Line, so close to it, in fact, that she tells the camera that the line probably runs right through her living room. She's lived there since she was a baby, and now going to school on the other side of the Green Line has to defend her position as a settler to her Israeli classmates. In one scene, Leora debates the settlements in class, defending her position and the position of other settlers against classmates who implore her to consider the fact that Palestinians live there too. Afterwards, she sits down for lunch with a friend and has what I think is one of the most frank and compassionate discussions I've witnessed between a left-leaning Israeli and a settler. This student asks Leora, "Isn't it hard to live like that?" "It's hard. It's so complicated," Leora replies. "Do you meet them halfway? Do you try to understand them?" her friend asks, referring to the Palestinians. "It's hard to understand when you're so angry about things that happened in the past," Leora replies. "You may not agree, but occupation exists," Leora's friend says. "It destroys us. It corrupts our love for this place and for one another." Leora pauses and adds, "It's hard to give up on a memory." "For sure," her friend says. "It's hard to imagine that my father's dream might simply vanish," Leora says. "Is it your own dream?" her friend asks. "Or your father's dream?"
What I'm trying to say is this is not an active everyday choice. "Oh, I want to be a settler." This is how these women grew up. And we have to understand that after 50 years, we have second and third generation settlers already who had grown into this reality. So we cannot also expect them to adapt our point of view just because we think the way they live is wrong. So I think we are nearing a point where we as a society have to say, what do we want? Do we want to continue? Do we want to fortify the settlements? Or do we want to find a solution which will be sustainable and just? And I think Armed, in a way, touches, I would say, a raw nerve. We have to make up our minds. It's been 50 years, and we cannot go on living without a defined border. I think history shows that occupation usually does not last that long. And we have to think about this young generation of settlers who have been born into this reality, and they're going to have their world taken away from them.
As I was speaking with Dr. Levine-Schnur, our legal expert from before, about the implications of Israel's settlement policies, she made an interesting point. The legal battle over land in the West Bank plays out primarily in the Israeli Supreme Court these days. And while the international community by and large writes off all Israeli settlements as illegal, the Israeli government takes a different approach. Within Area C, the section of land in the West Bank you'll remember that remains under full Israeli control, the government allows cultivation and use of lands without an owner, land they call public property. Any settlement built on land that can be proven to be owned by a Palestinian would, in theory, be deemed illegal by the courts and forcibly removed. But, and here's the kicker, when a Palestinian resident of the West Bank wishes to prove their ownership of a certain tract of land, he or she is held to the burden of proof set by a very, very old law from the Ottoman Empire. This law stipulates that a claimant needs to present proof of having cultivated this land for a period of 10 years. Of course, Dr. Levine-Schnur says this is often impossible and can be open to a wide array of interpretations by the court. Does it need to be constantly cultivated, as in growing crops every year for the past 10 years? Does one need to prove that the landowner himself cultivated the land with his own hands? Other than making legal recourse increasingly difficult for Palestinians, however, this policy has led to another strange shift in power in the West Bank. This political conflict was transferred from the public arena, as in something fought by military organizations or something negotiated by politicians, to the private arena. A conflict fought by individual families and communities, sometimes in a legal sense and sometimes in a violent one. A conflict in which a small group of extremists on either side act out violently against members of the other group, in order, they hope, to drive the other away. Only, All signs in recent history show that this doesn't work. All it does, in fact, is make more people on the other side more radical.
A terrorist entered a private home in the settlement of Itamar and brutally murdered 5 people, 3 children and 2 parents. The result is fatal, and it means that the IDF has begun in a military operation to try and put our hands on these perpetrators.
The terrorist murdered a young family, a mother, a father, a boy of 11, a boy of 4, a baby girl of 4 months. They all had their throats slit. They were sleeping in their beds and they were savagely murdered by animals.
I want to see the light in the edge of the tunnel. Unfortunately, I don't see it. If you have to deal with such people, that the word human beings doesn't fit them. They behave like animals, like beasts.
In the West Bank town of Hebron, a U.S.-born Israeli settler named Baruch Goldstein opens fire in a crowded mosque.
More than 2,000 Hamas followers rallied on the 4th anniversary of the massacre, in which the American-born Jewish settler opened fire on a crowd of Muslims at prayer. Hamas called on the congregation to avenge the 29 Muslims killed that day. In this so-called holy war, Hamas has avenged those who died many times over in bomb attacks on Israeli buses, in marketplaces.
I think that his act brought a lot of security to the Jewish people here in Hebron and Kiryat Arba. A person that is willing to sacrifice his life for security of his nation, even if people think that he's wrong. I don't think that he's wrong. I think that this act is holy and the person is holy too.
There are so many things we could talk about in regards to the West Bank. A long history of pain and retaliation, waves of anger and violence, one after the next. I could seek out extremists from each side and ask them why they feel that violence and intimidation are the answer. But interviewing extremists has been done before. If that's what you want, you can turn to YouTube, where dozens of interviews exist, offering, I think, only voyeurism and sensationalism. And while it is important to look the extremism that exists in the eyes and ask why it exists, we'll do that in another episode. To offer you only violence in this episode would be to do you a disservice. Instead, I'm going to introduce you to an activist who's working in Hebron to spread the message to his fellow Palestinians of the power of nonviolent resistance. And in Gush Etzion, to a religious settler who is working alongside his Palestinian neighbors to open up channels of dialogue between two groups who, although they live near one another, rarely, if ever, come into contact.
Personally, I believe in nonviolence as a tactic and as an ideology and as a strategy. By time, you feel the power of nonviolence. You can't be convinced about nonviolence without practicing it. It's completely different.
This is Issa Amro, the founder of the Hebron-based organization Youth Against Settlements. We met one rainy afternoon several months ago at his organization's building, an old 2-story house nestled into an olive grove on one side of a hill. It's actually incredibly hard for me to locate him when I come for a visit. I spend a good amount of time attempting to find my way through Hebron's divisions. Because I'm coming from Jerusalem, the bus drops me off on the side of the city that adjoins the settlement of Kiryat Arba, which you'll remember from before was founded by the religious Israelis who came to Hebron in 1967. Today, the city of Hebron, which is the second largest city in the Palestinian territories, is split into 2 parts, according to a complex series of agreements from 1997 called the Hebron Protocols, which were sort of put into place, but were also never ratified by either side and never progressed along the forward trajectory they were supposed to. You know, the typical shtick here. The main result of these sort of protocols was the creation of H1, the Palestinian side of the city, which makes up about 80% of Hebron, and H2, the Israeli side, which makes up the other 20%. It's a sort of surreal cutting up of the city, which has a hefty Israeli military presence for the protection of Hebron's 800 or so Jewish residents. A teeny tiny minority within Greater Hebron, which has a population of something like 215,000. After a lot of stumbling around into dead ends guarded by soldiers who told me to turn back, a 16-year-old Palestinian boy named Bashir takes pity on me and shows me the way.
My name is Bashir, and you?
Bashir, I'm Skyler.
Welcome, Skyler. Welcome to Palestine, everybody.
Once we arrive over the windy crest of the hill, we come upon a group of teenagers playing cards on the patio of the compound. I wait with them for Issa, who never sets an exact time for his meetings and always travels with friends. It's not safe any other way, he tells me. Issa is a prominent figure in Hebron, although he's largely despised by the Israelis because of his engagement in demonstrations and protests. Since the early 2000s, he's been a sort of rising star in the Palestinian nonviolence scene. He got a start in activism, protesting the Israeli army's closure of his university during the Second Intifada.
The Israeli army closed the university by a military order. I went crazy, and it was so selfish, reaction from me to reopen the university. So it was not political, it was that. I wanted to resist the closure of my personal university. That was a big success story, that I got my degree and I got my political, start,
Despite his family's wishes, Issa continued to learn about peaceful organizing and to think of the main issues that affected the Palestinians of Hebron, namely what he saw as the limitation of their freedom of movement, their freedom of expression, and of the heavy burden of the Israeli military presence in the city. In order to not stress his parents out, however, Issa said he sometimes had to take drastic measures.
I was hiding everything, just recently I was blocking my mother from Facebook.
You blocked your mother on Facebook?
Yes, I didn't want her to see what is happening to me.
And what Issa meant by what's happening to him is a long litany of trouble with authorities on both sides of the conflict. It turns out neither the IDF nor the Palestinian Authority are big fans of his protest movement, which criticizes what Issa calls human rights abuses by both parties. The result of this, of course, is that Issa has been to prison quite a few times. He doesn't mind this, he says, because he's almost always released quickly, but the experience has reshaped the way he thinks about the roots of violence in young people.
So one time I was arrested, in the detention center. I told the guards of the army, me, I don't mind. I know what I'm doing. You will not change my attitude. I will not come with a personal revenge attitude against you. Shut up, you are a terrorist. I told them, I'm not terrorist. I will go to court and go home. They said, no. I told them, okay, if I go home today, do you listen to me? He said, yes. So I went to court, release me. They have nothing against me. I went back to him, I told him, look, release order from the court. Come to listen. No, you promised me. I told them, stop creating suicide bombers in here. Because the kids are here in the detention center, 16, 17 years old, they were with me. Many of them were crying during the night, crying. They come here, maybe they throw stones toward a military jeep, maybe. And it's not the end of the world if they throw stones. Give them candy, give them chocolate. They will go back home, say, oh, we met a different soldier. But by what you do, you destroy their dignity. And when you destroy the dignity of a person, he has nothing to lose. And it doesn't, for him it will not be political anymore, it will be personal. And he will go out with personal revenge.
Internally, within his own community, part of Issa's work to encourage nonviolence has meant that he's become something of a one-man neighborhood watch committee, receiving calls from parents who worry that their teenagers might do something violent. Issa asks what color clothes they're wearing, what time they left home, in which direction they were walking, and he goes to intercept the teenager to have a conversation with them, to convince them that whatever idea was on their mind isn't the answer.
I do my best to stop them because I don't want them first to die. Second, I don't want them to be violent. Here, I met two girls, and they told me, Issa, we are ready to die. I told them, okay, I will help you to die, but not now, after 50 years. So be long-term activist. Killing people will not help you, will not help Palestine. Killing, soldier, okay, you kill 100 soldiers, what you get, Nothing. You will, in the contrary, you are killing people, and that is wrong. So it's easy to convince if you have someone to give them hope. I concentrate on hope always, because I know they lost hope.
So here's a Palestinian who's supposed to be a primitive terrorist, and he's telling me a story of personal transformation. It's like, what do I do with it? Where do I put that?
This is Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger, one of the leaders of a local West Bank movement called Roots. Spearheaded by the Palestinian peace activist Ali Abu Awad, Roots is a weekly discussion group between religious settlers and Palestinians who live in the West Bank. Rabbi Hanan, who describes himself as a passionate Zionist settler, immigrated to Israel when he was 20 years old and has lived over the Green Line in Gush Etzion for more than 30 years. We met on the Abu Awad's farm, where Roots convenes for its meetings, to talk about the organization, its work, and about his own experience speaking with a Palestinian for the first time.
What was it like?
It was suddenly realizing that everything I knew about reality was only half true. It was suddenly like being hit in the gut by the realization that there's another reality in this land that's right under my nose, and I never saw it.
Like many religious settlers, Rabbi Hanan was motivated to live past the Green Line by his passion for his faith and his personal religious attachment to the land. For decades, he said, the only encounters he had had with Palestinians were shadowy and glancing. They were the ones responsible for violent attacks on his friends or on friends of his friends. And so, for about 30 years, that was who they were to him, attackers. But one afternoon, a few years ago, when Rabbi Hanan came to this very farm where we now sat, that image came crashing down around him. He approached a woman named Sadia, her husband Jamal, and their teenage son, Yazin, and began speaking with them. On this particular afternoon, Yazin wore a sweatshirt that had the words, "Seeds of Peace," written across it. Rabbi Hanan says that for him, the word peace was so completely disjointed from the word Palestinian that he assumed Yazin must not understand what his own sweatshirt said.
So I said, half jokingly, Yazin, what's this Seeds of Peace thing? He tells me it's a camp in Maine, USA that takes Palestinian Israeli kids out of the conflict zone for a summer of recreation and reconciliation. And he just got back 5 months ago, and it changed his life, and he has Israeli friends on Facebook. He told me he was so affected by the summer that he wants to spend some of his life building bridges of reconciliation between our two peoples. And I'm listening to what he's saying, and I don't know if I can believe him, because it's just impossible. So I was just confused is not the word. I was completely undone.
Since that moment, Rabbi Hanan says, he's undergone what he can only describe as a radical change in his worldview, one that didn't come without a great deal of pain and confusion as he became friends with the Palestinian members of Roots. And his new worldview is one that often clashes with mainstream settler opinion. In these moments, he says, a small comfort are his conversations with children.
My relatives on my wife's side, they're all Haredim, ultra-Orthodox. Just 3 days ago, we had a picnic. There's this little kid, he's 14 years old, and I'm pretty close to him, and he's very open. He just said, Hanan, what do you do? So we started talking, and the conversation was fascinating. So I tell them I work to bring Israelis and Palestinians together, and then the kid said, why would I want to be Palestinians? They're all terrorists. And I said something, and he immediately left behind the stock statements and said, wow, that's interesting. And I said something more, and he said, that makes sense. And then I said something more, and he said, I'd like to meet them also.
Perhaps most notably from our conversation, Rabbi Hanan and I talked at length about how he now incorporates this worldview with his old one. How has it changed his religious practice or his belief or his connection to the land, I asked. He responded quite simply that he found comfort, as always, in religious texts and rabbinic commentary, only he saw it now through a slightly different prism.
Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cohen Cook was the first chief rabbi of the reconstituted settlement here, was a great mystic. He says a number of places, in my paraphrase, that being that the world is full of sparks of truth, you have to ask yourself, is there such a thing as falsehood? If it's all true, is anything false? And he seems to answer that unfortunately the world is full of falsehood. How could that be if it's all true? And his answer is so profound. His answer is that falsehood is partial truth masquerading as complete truth. The world is full of that. Everyone thinks that they have the truth and the only truth, and the other truths are not true, they're false. So it turns out, according to Rav Kook, that the true truth is the truth that listens to other truths and incorporates them. And that's what we have to do.
So, what's going to happen with the West Bank in the regions known to many as Judea and Samaria? I don't know. I'm not sure anyone does, but I turned to Dr. Sara Yael Hirschhorn, someone whose entire career is dedicated to studying the situation, to ask her if she had any clues, any lessons maybe that we can take away from the recent history to tell us how to move forward.
Well, first of all, I think that a peace process has to be negotiated between Israelis and Palestinians. It's not something that you can sort of, take a file out of a desk drawer in Washington, D.C. or London or, Saudi Arabia and unfurl. And I think that sometimes that sentiment is lost. The growth of the settlements really exponentially since the 1990s may really foreclose the two-state solution in a certain way because it's going to be very difficult to carve up territory even in the same way that maybe was an option on the table in the 1990s. So I'm a little bit concerned with the window for the two-state solution is closing, and that's not just because of the settlements, although it is in part because of the settlements, but, we're running out of time here to implement something that it's not clear that majorities of either population really want today. And you can't make peace on the move. We have to make peace in Israel-Palestine and do what people, in Israel and in, I guess, the future state of Palestine want to happen for their futures.
Next time on Intractable, we take on that very question. What do the people of Israel and the Palestinian territories really want? We'll talk to some of the foremost statisticians who are attempting to answer this question. We'll take our first peek inside Gaza, and we'll talk to a psychologist who thinks he may have the answer to what it is in the human brain that keeps conflicts like this one from being solved. For now, I'm Skyler Inman, and this has been Intractable.